Every empire invents its own blood sport. Rome poured concrete into a giant bowl and fed prisoners to lions, while the crowd chewed bread in the cheap seats. And 2,000 years later, America built something cheaper, faster, and a hell of a lot more efficient. The tabloid press. No lions, no sand, no emperor. Just a wall of flashbulbs parked outside a Tribeca apartment every single morning, waiting for one woman to step outside. Her name, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, born in 1966, gone by 1999. And in the 33 years between those dates, she managed something almost nobody famous in her era even attempted. She never gave a single interview, not one, not ever. The most photographed woman in the country, hunted daily by grown men whose mortgages depended on her face, died without once explaining herself to the public that consumed her. Now, the title of this video promises a dark side, and I intend to keep that promise, just not the way the thumbnail suggests. Real darkness runs through this story, the kind that wrecks careers and poisons sleep, and eventually follows 3 people all the way down to the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. None of it lived inside her. All of it lived in the machine around her, a machine that hunted this woman while she breathed. And then, when she lay safely dead, beyond the reach of any libel lawyer, published books about her that her own friends call fiction. And yes, videos with dark side in the title usually run a familiar hustle. Dig up a rumor, light it dramatically, let the thumbnail do the lying. This one runs the opposite direction. This video names every rumor, sources it, and then takes it apart piece by piece, because what verifiably happened to one private woman needs no exaggeration from anyone. The documented version already reads darker than anything the gossip pages invented. So consider what follows the version the tabloids never printed, assembled from the people who actually knew her, from biographers who did the legwork, and from federal investigators who pulled wreckage out of the sea and wrote down exactly what they found. No blind items. Just the record, speaking for a woman denied the chance to speak for herself. Before the flashbulbs, before the famous last name, before the black car idling at the curb, Carolyn Bessette folded clothes at a shopping mall in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. Sit with that image for a second. The woman later credited as one of the architects of Calvin Klein's minimalist empire started her working life as a sales assistant on a retail floor, under fluorescent lights, absorbing the same soul-flattening mall soundtrack as every other 20-something in America. And then she climbed. Not through connections, not through a famous father, not through some fairy tale discovery at a lunch counter, but through the unglamorous grind of being genuinely good at her job. Bessette worked her way from that sales floor to Calvin Klein headquarters in New York City, where she rose to publicist and then director of show productions, which in the 1990s fashion world meant she helped decide what American cool actually looked like. If director of show productions sounds like corporate wallpaper, translate it into plain language. She ran the machinery behind runway shows for one of the biggest fashion houses on earth, a job combining military logistics, crisis therapy, and lion taming. Except the lions are models, photographers, and one famously particular designer. Nobody hands that job to someone cold and vacant. That job belongs to the person the whole building trusts when everything catches fire at once. Understand what Calvin Klein meant back then too. The brand did far more than sell clothing. It set the mood for a decade of stripped down, monochrome, less is everything American style. And according to biographer Elizabeth Beller, Carolyn operated inside that engine as anything but an interchangeable staffer. Calvin Klein himself trusted her as a confidant, and her fingerprints ended up all over the brand's minimalist 1990s look, the one fashion still copies every time it rediscovers restraint. Her timing, in fairness, bordered on perfect, because the decade wanted exactly what that brand knew how to build. Clean lines, quiet confidence, luxury that whispered instead of shouted. But timing only opens doors. Talent still has to carry the furniture through them, and hers did, over and over, season after season. Plenty of ambitious people crowded that same hallway during those same years, and most stayed anonymous forever, because most of them never became the person a famously particular designer leaned on when the stakes rose. The record, right about here, starts arguing with the legend. Beller tracked down the people who shared offices with Carolyn, shared apartments with her, and sweated beside her through Fashion Week chaos, and their collective memory refuses to cooperate with the myth. They describe someone exceptionally warm, intensely loyal, self-deprecating, and genuinely supportive of the people around her. That testimony turns boring fast. boring in this story matters enormously because the boring version comes from name sources, while the exciting version comes from people selling magazines. And she kept that career humming after John entered the picture, at least through the early years of the relationship, holding down her own professional life while dating the most famous man in America. Independence runs through everything her colleagues remember. The tabloids would later sketch a social climber. The resume, inconveniently, sketched an employee who built everything herself. Keep that straight before the Kennedy name takes over this story. By the time John arrived, Carolyn already owned a career, a reputation, and a paycheck, all of it built on her own, inside one of the most brutally competitive industries on the planet. The mall girl from Chestnut Hill conquered New York fashion before most of America learned her name. Then she fell in love, and the country decided it owned her. Enter John F. Kennedy Jr., and with him, the hurricane. Here stood the son of a murdered president, raised in front of cameras from childhood, the closest thing the United States has ever produced to a crown prince. Historian Stephen Gillen titled his biography of the man America's Reluctant Prince, which tells you exactly how the country regarded him. When Carolyn fell in with John, she did not simply gain a partner. She inherited 100 million self-appointed in-laws, most of them holding opinions and too many of them holding cameras. A quick word on the family, though you hardly need one. The Kennedys, the presidency, the tragedies, the myth machine, an American saga so thoroughly rehearsed that your grandmother can recite it during commercial breaks. You know the story. What matters here is the gravity of that name, because gravity is exactly what it exerted, dragging every camera in New York toward whichever woman stood beside America's prince. What followed her into that relationship is documented, verified, and honestly difficult to comprehend at scale. Photographers established a daily presence outside the couple's Tribeca apartment, a permanent occupying force on a residential street, waiting for her to do anything at all. Step out, hail a cab, exist in daylight. Other celebrities face paparazzi at premieres and airports. Carolyn faced them at her own front door, every damn morning for years, with no off-season and no finish line. Picture the arithmetic of that for a moment, because daily paparazzi presence flattens something brutal into bureaucratic language. Wake up, and they are there. Come home from dinner, and they are still there, shouting, angling, burning through film on the off chance of a frown they can caption into a crisis. A single hostile stranger outside your home would justify a police call in any normal life, yet dozens of them outside hers counted as an industry, protected, profitable, and entirely legal. She counterattacked with silence, and the maneuver approached elegance. Remember, this woman worked as a publicist by trade. She understood the fame economy down to its gears, which levers moved it and what fed it. So she starved it. No interviews, ever. Not a sit-down with a friendly magazine, not a softball morning show appearance, not one sentence handed over for public consumption during her entire time in the spotlight. In a decade, when everyone talked to everyone about everything, the most wanted voice in America stayed shut. Measure that choice against its era to feel the full strangeness of it. The 1990s practically invented the confessional celebrity, with talk shows multiplying, tell-alls stacking up in airport bookstores, and publicists booking redemption tours before scandals even cooled. Into that shouting decade walked a woman with elite media training, and she chose to reveal nothing at all to anyone ever. Editors must have lost their minds, all that demand, and the supply simply declined to exist. Both of her major biographers, Beller on her side of the marriage and Gillen on John's, land on the same verified fact from opposite directions. Not one interview, ever, across her entire time in public life. Sources this separate rarely agree so completely. 2 research projects, 2 archives, 2 sets of witnesses, and 1 identical conclusion about her silence, which should tell you how solid the ground under this chapter actually is. Everything else about her attracted dispute at some point, but her refusal to talk never did, and the machine, denied its content, did not politely pack up and leave. It escalated. Verified accounts gathered by Beller describe crowds of reporters mobbing Carolyn when she tried to attend private job interviews, and yes, that sentence deserves a second read. A professional woman with a serious resume attempting to interview for ordinary work was physically swarmed by the press until the effort collapsed entirely. The coverage that fed on her fame actively wrecked her ability to earn a paycheck, then rolled on without consequence. They dug the hole and then they photographed her standing in it. The toll on her cut deep, and it remains one of the few private facts the record confirms without argument. Friends and biographers agree that constant surveillance produced severe anxiety, exactly what you would expect from any human being living under a permanent lens. She hated the press deeply and never bothered hiding it. Beller and Gillon both document her distaste for the paparazzi and their tactics. Anxiety under those conditions is not a scandal or a secret. Anxiety under those conditions is the same response of a normal mind to an insane situation. Hold on to that distinction, because every ugly thing printed about her in the years after her death grows out of this exact soil and out of nowhere else. A press corps she refused to feed, an anxiety they manufactured, then reported on as though they stumbled across it growing wild. The siege came first. Stories about her supposed dark side came after, written and sold by the people running the siege. The tabloids needed a character because a silent woman sells no magazines, so they simply wrote one for her. Their invention became the Ice Queen, aloof, calculating, a beautiful and unknowable schemer who bagged America's prince and now refused, out of sheer arrogance, to smile for the men camped on her sidewalk. The fiction proved impressively durable, and like most durable fictions, it required ignoring every person who ever actually knew the woman. Give the tabloids this much: the caricature took hold, and historians confirm how widely it spread. Aloof and calculating became the default public reading of her, repeated across outlets until repetition did the work that evidence never could, and until millions of strangers who never breathed the same air as her carried a confident opinion about her personality. Manufactured consensus works exactly like that. The trick lands hardest on subjects who refuse to defend themselves, since silence leaves the caricature standing unopposed. Elizabeth Beller hunted for the Ice Queen and could not locate her anywhere. For the 2024 biography, Beller interviewed former colleagues, old roommates, and peers from across the fashion industry, the exact population positioned to know whether the caricature held up, and their answer came back close to unanimous. Colleague after colleague described a woman who ran warm, guarded her friendships with real ferocity, championed her peers, and aimed her sharpest jokes squarely at herself. Quite the Ice Queen. Dozens of independent mouths, and not one of them remembered any Frost. Self-deprecating deserves special attention on that list, because it quietly demolishes the whole Ice Queen architecture. Cold people never volunteer as the punchline. Turning yourself into the joke requires warmth, security, and a genuine interest in putting other people at ease, the exact qualities her coworkers mention again and again. The Frost existed only in print, applied there by writers who never stepped within 100 feet of her. So how does a warm, funny, loyal woman turn into frozen royalty in print? She declined to perform, and that alone did it. American celebrity culture in the 1990s ran on one unwritten contract. We hand you fame, and you hand us access, and everybody profits. Carolyn tore that contract up, and the culture, unable to punish her with obscurity, punished her with characterization instead. A woman who will not speak finds herself spoken for. A face that will not smile on command earns the label cold in print, no matter how much laughter actually fills the private rooms the cameras never reach. Notice which sources sit on which side of this argument before choosing a side yourself. Over here, anonymous tabloid copy, produced on deadline by strangers who never met her. Over there, name friends, name colleagues, and a biographer who put her sources on the record, all describing, independently and in detail, the same warm and loyal person. The Ice Queen survives only in yellowing magazine pages, because testimony buried that character decades ago. The marriage deserves its own chapter, because this is where the tabloids planted their deepest flag, and where honest history has to walk carefully. Nobody seriously claims a friction-free union. Genuine strain shows up in the record, along with occasional public disputes, and one afternoon in particular that ended up immortalized on tape and replayed for the rest of the century. In 1996, in Washington Square Park, John and Carolyn erupted into an explosive argument in full public view, and an onlooker caught the whole thing on video. That much is a verified fact. The footage reached print at the time and has drawn references ever since, from the New York Post to Vanity Fair. A couple arguing in a park rates, on the grand scale of human behavior, about as scandalous as a burnt dinner, but a couple arguing in a park on camera when one of them carries the most famous surname in America, becomes a national event, replayed and dissected and stretched into proof of whatever a headline needed proving. One camcorder clip of one bad afternoon ended up carrying decades of narrative weight it could never actually hold. Single data points work that way in tabloid physics. 1,000 quiet evenings generate no footage at all, while one loud argument in a park replays forever, and the archive ends up preserving the exception as the rule. One honest disclaimer before this continues, and I swear the hedging matters more here than in anything else I have ever covered. Careful qualifiers sound boring, and boring loses viewers, and every creator on this platform knows it. But this particular woman spent her whole public life being confidently described by people who invented their material, so precision stops being a stylistic choice in her case and becomes the entire point of the exercise. Where the record reads partially verified, you will hear exactly that phrasing. She earned at least that much. The final months of the marriage split into layers, and each layer deserves its own label. One layer is partially verified. Shortly before July 1999, John spent a night or two away from home at the Stanhope Hotel. Another layer is pure tabloid, with Edward Klein's book later leading the charge, spinning that hotel stay into a marriage supposedly days from divorce when the plane crashed. And a third layer comes from the people closest to the couple, historian Stephen Gillen, and friends who spoke to. People confirmed that John and Carolyn attended marriage counseling together, actively working the problem rather than filing the paperwork. Only one of those layers rests on named sources. Sit with the difference between those layers for a second. The phrases, "he spent a night at a hotel" and "the marriage lay in ruins," occupy two different planets of meaning, and only the first one carries any verification at all. Tabloids collapse that distance on purpose. Distance, after all, is where the boring facts live, and collapse is where headlines mint their money. A couple in counseling is a couple still fighting for the marriage, which reads as the exact opposite of the story the tabloids ran. Quitters skip therapy. Whatever private struggles John and Carolyn carried, the credible evidence points to two people trying, under conditions that would have cracked granite, while the divorce rumor points mostly to publishers who understood that a couple in therapy sells fewer copies than a marriage in flames. Consider, too, what an ordinary rough patch even looks like under those conditions. Most couples argue about money and family and time behind a closed door, and the argument dies there, harmless, forgotten by breakfast. These two conducted a marriage inside a pressure chamber with glass walls, where a bad afternoon became a cover story and a raised voice became a franchise. The wonder is not that they struggled. The wonder is that anybody in that box ever managed a quiet Tuesday. On July 16, 1999, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy died. Keep that date in view, because everything in this chapter happened after it, and the timing is the entire disgrace. The books discussed here targeted a woman who could no longer answer, took aim at a family drowning in grief, and carried price tags built for the bestseller rack. Dead women file no lawsuits, and publishers understand that math perfectly. Edward Klein arrived first. His 2003 book, The Kennedy Curse, printed the ugliest version of Carolyn ever put on paper. A woman allegedly driven by paparazzi-induced paranoia into deep isolation and heavy cocaine use. A recluse unraveling behind the Tribeca door. Strong claims. Strong claims demand strong evidence. And on evidence, the book collapses because reputable biographers and the people who shared her life reject the portrait outright. Beller's research confirms media-driven anxiety and documents it with care. Nobody credible found the addict, the recluse, or the unraveling, and historians alongside her intimates have labeled the heavy drug story tabloid fiction, unsubstantiated from top to bottom. Notice the trick, because it belongs to the oldest chapter of the tabloid playbook. Take a verified fact, in this case her documented anxiety under surveillance, then inflate it past recognition until a suffering woman turns into a scandalous one. Anxiety earns sympathy, and sympathy sells poorly, while addiction and paranoia move units. The trade dressed a real wound up as a character flaw, and a woman 4 years dead absorbed a reputation she never earned and never received a chance to contest. Unauthorized, by the way, is publishing's polite word for a book the subject and family wanted no part of, and it deserves translation every time it appears near a cover. No cooperation from the people who knew her best. No access to her friends, her letters, or her side of a single event, all of it replaced by anonymous sourcing and confident guesswork. An authorized account answers to living witnesses, while an unauthorized one answers mainly to a deadline. And the gap between those two systems explains most of the rot on the Carolyn shelf of your local bookstore. Then came Michael Bergen, and his entry might rank as the grimmest of the lot. In 2004, the former boyfriend published a tell-all memoir alleging, among other things, that Carolyn turned volatile and physically abusive during their past relationship. Those allegations remain unverified to this day, and worse than unverified. Mutual friends and former Calvin Klein executives publicly tore the claims apart, with Lynn Tesoro among those dismissing the book as a fabricated attempt to cash in on a tragedy. A man watched a woman he once dated die in a plane crash, waited for grief to ripen the market, and then sold America a story her closest people call a lie. Every industry has a floor, and publishing in 2004 dug straight for the basement. And the pushback never stopped. Decades on, online archives and discussion communities still pick Bergen's claims apart line by line, and the people who knew her still speak on record whenever the old allegations crawl back into circulation. A lie about a dead woman turned out to have a long shelf life, but so did the people determined to correct it. The correction crew works for free, while the liars collect advances. The refutations, for the record, never came from one loyal friend circling a wagon. They arrived in waves and from every direction, reporting in people within a year of the crash. Gillon's 2019 biography of John, Beller's 2024 biography of Carolyn built on named interviews, and former Calvin Klein colleagues speaking up whenever the claims resurface. 20-plus years of accumulating testimony sits on one side of the scale, and two cash-in books sit on the other. Weigh that however you like. Ask who profits from a dark side, and this whole chapter explains itself. A warm publicist with anxiety earns nobody a dime, while a cocaine-addled, violent, unraveling mystery woman fills a bestseller list. The dark side of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, as sold in bookstores, never qualified as a discovery. It arrived as a product, designed after her death, refuted by her friends, and purchased by a public that never heard her side of anything, because she lay at the bottom of the ocean at 33 years old. The jokes stop here, because the story does too. On the night of July 16, 1999, a light Piper Saratoga aircraft carried 3 people over the Atlantic. John F. Kennedy Jr. at the controls, Carolyn beside him, and her sister, Lauren Bessette. Somewhere in the darkness off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, the plane plunged into the water, and all 3 of them died that night. For once in this whole saga, no speculation is required. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted a full federal investigation and published its findings in the public record, where anyone can read them today. Investigators determined the probable cause plainly. The pilot lost control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, the documented result of spatial disorientation. Behind that clinical phrase sits a very human sequence of events, and it deserves plain explanation rather than mythology. Haze hung over the water that night, and darkness swallowed the horizon. The one visual reference a pilot's senses lean on hardest. John held certification for visual flight rules, meaning he flew by what his eyes could see, and he carried no instrument rating, the additional training for flying blind on gauges alone. Over dark water, in haze, eyesight quits as a navigation tool. The inner ear then starts reporting turns that are not happening, and level flight that is not level. And without instruments, a pilot cannot separate sensation from fact. Somewhere in that descent, he lost his bearings, and the airplane followed his hands into the sea. Rumors circled this crash for years anyway, because rumors always circle Kennedy. The federal record answers them without raising its voice. Post-crash examinations found no evidence of mechanical failure, no anomalies, and no foul play of any kind, which retracts every conspiracy in a single line of a government report. A night flight, a hazy sky, a vanished horizon, and a pilot untrained for instrument conditions. The causes fit inside one paragraph. After a lifetime of wild stories written about her, the truest account of Carolyn's final hour turned out to be the driest document in the entire archive. Carolyn Bessette deserves a line of her own in every telling, and she rarely receives one. Carolyn's sister boarded that plane as a passenger and ended up a footnote in another family's mythology, one more life folded into a legend that never belonged to her. The Atlantic took 3 people that night, though history, being careless, mostly remembers 2. So the title of this video comes due, and the debt clears in full. The dark side of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy contained no cocaine, no violence, and no divorce waiting in a drawer. Every one of those stories traces back to sources her friends, her colleagues, and her biographers call fiction. The darkness sat somewhere else entirely, inside a business model. Follow the verified record instead, and a different silhouette rises out of the noise. A saleswoman from a Massachusetts mall builds a career on pure talent and ends up shaping the defining American aesthetic of her decade. Her marriage then plays out inside a glass box. Grown men bang on the walls of that box for a paycheck, daily, for years, and the industry employing them calls it coverage. And at 33, she vanishes into dark water beside her husband and her sister, after which that same industry spends decades selling stories about demons her own people swear she never carried. She answered all of it with the one weapon she ever used. Silence. Not the frozen silence the tabloids invented, but the deliberate silence of a publicist who understood the machine down to its bolts and refused to feed it a single sentence. That refusal cost her jobs, cost her peace, and probably cost her years of open, unguarded living. Yet it never cracked. Not once, through every ambush and every invented scandal. In an era that confused exposure with existence, the most hunted woman in America held her tongue for her entire public life, and that might be the most defiant act any celebrity of her generation managed. Every era congratulates itself for outgrowing the last one's cruelty, and every era finds a fresh way to repeat it. The 1990s put its cruelty on glossy paper and sold it at supermarket checkouts. Whatever your decade sells it on, the mechanism survives untouched. Pick a woman, write her character for her, and then punish her publicly for declining the role. Carolyn's story reads less like history and more like a warning that nobody bothered to heed. The machine, for the record, still runs. In 2026, American television is dramatizing her life yet again, and magazines publish explainers separating the documented woman from the scripted one. 27 years past the crash, she remains raw material for an industry that never once heard her voice and never will. Profitable and endlessly reusable with every retelling. Somewhere inside that arrangement sits everything this video exists to argue. Remember her the way the record shows her, not the way the paperback sold her. Warm where they printed ice. Loyal where they printed schemes. Sane and struggling. And human where they printed madness. The tabloids needed a villain in that Tribeca apartment, and for 30 years they kept inventing one, because the alternative meant admitting the villain stood outside on the sidewalk, holding a camera, pointed at a woman who never signed up for any of it. The cameras captured everything except her voice, which she kept, and keeps still.